human evolution starting back up, and how does that relate to women's rights? Welcome to my channel. My name is Renee Stonebreaker, and today we are doing the deep dive on my viral TikTok hypothesis that the low birth rate is an indicator that human evolution is starting back up again. So first things first, I want to go ahead and address what we're going to be going over for this entire video. We're going to be discussing what my hypothesis is, all of the foundation behind that, so what theories and what arguments have come before it in order for mine to be viable. I'm also going to be addressing some different aspects that people have brought up in response to the original video. If you're only interested in a specific section, definitely check out the description where I will put in some timestamps so that you can travel through and skip ahead to whatever you would like to see. With that being said, let's go ahead and get started. So first things first, we want to talk about what my actual hypothesis is. So in a more formal sense, and I do have a screen behind the camera that I'm reading off of, my hypothesis is that human evolution has slowed by the suppression of both natural selection and sexual selection due to the patriarchy and the advent of civilization and all the things that come with it. As women gain unprecedented reproductive agency and global birth rates decline, women are collectively exercising sexual selection on a scale not seen in recorded history, potentially restarting or accelerating human evolution. And I want to be crystal clear here, the first part of that human evolution has been slowed, is not my hypothesis. It is not an original thought, and we will be discussing where that idea comes from and kind of the debate around that a little further in the video. But before we get to that, we have to talk about something even more foundational than that, which is Darwin's theory of evolution. So very importantly, under Darwin's original theory, he actually identified two separate drivers of evolution. The first one was natural selection, which most people are familiar with. Natural selection is when an offspring has some type of mutation. That mutation may be beneficial in survival, specifically in increasing the offspring's ability to survive into adulthood, and therefore helping that offspring survive into adulthood long enough in order to reproduce. However, the other driver of evolution that is often forgotten and has actually been referred to as Darwin's forgotten theory is sexual selection, or explicitly, female choosiness in mates. Darwin theorized that female choosiness in their mates was as significant of a driver of evolution as natural selection. So not only is predators and disease and environmental factors that are actually taking individuals out of a population before they're able to reproduce causing some type of pressure for evolution, but so is the mere fact that females in a species typically do not reproduce with just anybody. They tend to be very selective, they tend to be very picky, and that process is also a driver of evolution. And one thing that I want to state very plainly, these are two separate mechanisms as defined by Darwin. So no, sexual selection is not a part of natural selection per Darwin. Natural selection has to do with survivability. Sexual selection has to do with if a female will select a specific male of the species to reproduce with. The next thing that we need to talk about is if human evolution has stalled at all. So when we talk about if human evolution has stalled at all, we first need to talk about if natural selection has stalled at all. And I had quite a few people very confidently asserting that that's just not how evolution works. Evolution is happening all around us. Evolution is happening every day. And to those people, I would say, you're potentially right, but you're also potentially wrong. There is a big debate over if natural selection has slowed down in humans or not, and if humans have continued to evolve or not, and how long, if humans have stopped evolving, how long that factor has been present. And so there are two general camps on this. Now, I've decided I am just going to provide a reading list where a lot of these ideas come from in the description, just because it is kind of awkward for me to just sit here and spout off a bunch of different books and authors, but I will have the reading list down below and kind of a brief summary over which ideas we're coming from, which books, and kind of what those books are describing. So let's actually break down what the two sides are. Side one says human evolution absolutely has been continuing, and their core arguments, first off, are pointing to specific changes that we have been able to track, such as the development of lactase resistance in certain populations, the development of the sickle cell trait in parts of Africa, which provides some type of resistance to malaria, high altitude adaptations of the Tibetans. Things like that are unarguably adaptations, environmental adaptations that seem to have spread through a portion of the population. However, the question really becomes how little of a change constitutes evolution, or how large of a change constitutes human evolution. And so the camp on the other side of it is essentially saying that, per Darwin's original theory, the natural selection that he described is essentially non-existent in humans. Because of the advent of medicine and society and protection and safety nets and things like that, humans simply are not exposed to the factors that cause natural selection like other species are. Now, first camp says they may not be exposed to those kinds of natural selection pressures, but different pressures like cultural pressures have come up and kind of taken the place of that. Back on the opposing side, the other thing is obviously sexual selection has heavily slowed down and dampened, and that's, in my opinion, pretty hard to argue against. So let's get into that a little bit more. If sexual selection is specifically female agency and who they're going to reproduce with, it is very hard to say that humans have had access to this for pretty much all of recorded history, and that is because of the patriarchy. So the patriarchy here is being defined as the systematic subjugation of women. And the origin of the patriarchy is estimated by scholars to be between 6,000 and 10,000 years old. And really simply, the subjugation of women by men in human species precedes currency and precedes written communication. It has been going on for as long as we have been able to record history. And the patriarchy, by nature of what it is, removes agency from women. And that is done through a lot of different mechanisms. When women are bought and sold as property and used as a mechanism of status, they are not actually able to exercise agency over who they are reproducing with, or if they are going to reproduce at all. An important part of sexual selection is that not all females of a species will choose to reproduce. Not every female of a species is going to reproduce. It's not just who they are going to reproduce with. It does also involve if they reproduce at all and how much they reproduce. Back to how the patriarchy is affecting this. The patriarchy has, in essence, decimated the agency of women over their own reproduction largely until maybe 40 to 60 years ago. And we are not out of it yet. The patriarchy has not ended. But in the last 40 to 60 years, we have seen women's agency, women's choice, women's access to different options regarding their own reproduction explode worldwide. We have more freedoms today over our own reproductive choices than we have ever had in recorded history, ever. And that is where the hypothesis really stems from, is sexual selection has clearly been dampened in humans because of the patriarchy. Natural selection is arguably dampened in humans, and that is obviously up for debate, but that is the stance that this hypothesis is taking. And without either of those two evolutionary drivers, per Darwin himself, those are the two largest drivers of evolution, then human evolution has either stalled or slowed significantly. Now that we see agency of women over their own reproductive choices, we are reintroducing one of those drivers of evolution. We are reintroducing sexual selection, and therefore, as evidenced by the low birth rate, not just in the US, but on a global scale, which I will discuss more as well, we are seeing the very beginning of human evolution starting or accelerating again because of the introduction of sexual selection where it was previously removed. One of the other things that I wanted to get into on this deep dive is the response that I got when I said that there are theories that the patriarchy may have come about as a way to subvert sexual selection by women. And one of the biggest, I think, responses that I got were people simply stating that the patriarchy did not come about for that reason. The patriarchy came about because of land and paternal uncertainty and essentially the need or the want of humans to pass down their possessions from themselves to people in their family and ensure that their offspring was essentially holding on to the fruits of their labor, things like that. And I want to be clear, first and foremost, when we are talking about things that happened 6,000 to 10,000 years ago, Nobody has the answer, and we very well may never have a completely clear picture of it. We can inch little by little towards the truth all we want, but we simply do not know. The theory that the patriarchy originated as a way to subvert sexual selection is not my own. It is in the reading list if you want to check that out. But I want to be very clear. It is not contradictory to other theories about where the patriarchy came from. It is completely logical to think that a man who needed to subjugate a woman in order to pass their land, pass their possessions, pass their title, pass their status, what have you, onto their children, and they wanted to ensure that those children were theirs. It is rational that in that same society, a man would feel pressured or go to great lengths to ensure that he had a wife at all, that the fruits of his labor didn't simply die out with him, that he had some type of legitimate offspring to provide all of those items to. And by extension, that man would likely want a son specifically so that his possessions could be passed to his son and eventually to that child's future offspring as well. So these are not contradictory ideas. Both can be true, both likely contributed, in my opinion, both likely contributed to it. But the question of which one mattered more is, were men desperate to pass on their land, or were men initially concerned with simply not ever being selected by a woman? It's questionable. Now let's talk about what the ramifications of this is. I'm not going to dive into all of them just yet, but I want to talk about specifically when I suggested that we are most certainly dealing with suboptimal genes in humanity right now. And I want to be clear that I was being incredibly literal. Suboptimal meaning anything below or less than or underneath the absolute optimal level. And why I'm saying that and why I'm going to continue to stand by that is that under the patriarchy, there is, when we're talking about a time period of 6 to 10,000 years, it is guaranteed, it is certain that individuals who would not have been able to reproduce without being handed a wife, being handed a woman, being handed a female of the species by society through subjugation, it is guaranteed that some of those individuals without those factors would not have been able to reproduce, and therefore their genes would not be in the human genosphere, in the human gene pool today. It is guaranteed. And not just that, not just whether certain people would have been able to reproduce or not, it is certain that those people would, even if they were able to reproduce, likely would have been reproducing with a different individual. Okay? Not only did the patriarchy essentially force women into reproduction, it also forced men into marriages that they would not have been in. Between classism, racism, etc., all those other things, it removed people's ability to find a partner to reproduce with purely based on attraction and instinct. Does that make sense? So yes, when I say that everybody alive today is the result of less than optimal decisions being made. And that's the whole point, is these were decisions. These were decided. It wasn't instinct. It wasn't individual agency. It was powers that be forcing things, putting their thumb on the scale that caused this. And that is what I was talking about with that. I was being incredibly literal. Now I want to address the birth rate itself. There has been a perception that this hypothesis is very US central, very US coded, and that it's not actually taking into account what's going on in the world. And from that, a lot of people are saying that is not why the birth rate is low. The birth rate is not lowering just because women are expressing their own right to choose and have agency over this. It's low because of US policy, such as the student loan crisis, the cost of education, the cost of housing, the cost of healthcare, the cost of childcare, the cost of groceries, the environment, everything you can imagine. And while I'm not saying that any of those factors are not contributing to a low birth rate in the US, I want to point out something. The global birth rate all over the world is trending downwards into historic lows. Absolutely everywhere. So I do have some data here, so you're going to see me kind of read back up off this screen. So the global total fertility rate was around 4.9 in the 1950s, or every woman had an average of 5 kids, a little less than that. The current global fertility rate is 2.3. So in the last 70 years, we have seen it literally be halved. We are expecting the global fertility rate to dip below the replacement rate of 2.1 within the next 30 years. So by, let me see what this specific one is, by 2050, and that is an estimation from the UN World Population Prospects. So the global birth rate is trending down everywhere. There are still some places that have higher birth rates but are still dropping. So, for example, in parts of sub-Saharan Africa, the total fertility rate fell from 6.6 in the 1960s down to 3.8 as of last year in 2024, and is projected to drop down to 2.6 by 2050. So this is a global trend that we are seeing. And so you cannot assign low birth rates only to localized policy. Now, obviously, correlation does not equal causation, but it would be ignorant to not examine what is going on here. We are seeing record low birth rates all over the world, and we are also seeing more freedom of women all over the world. We are more free today than we have ever been in recorded history. Women have more agency over their reproductive health, over their reproductive decisions, over who they are going to partner with, if they're going to partner at all, if they're going to partner with somebody that they want to reproduce with, than we have ever had in recorded history. And this is the part where we have to acknowledge some things. There are absolutely still women who do not have access to, I'm going to say, the global average. There is absolutely areas of the world and even areas in the United States where women are still heavily subjugated, where women are being forced into marriages, where women are being forced into reproduction against their will. And I don't want to discredit that. I don't want to say, oh, great, we're more free than we've ever been, and look what we're doing, and we're done. We have a long way to go. And that is why I want to make it clear that if this hypothesis is true, we are at the very beginning. We are potentially the first generation or ground zero of seeing an actual effect of women having agency over their own reproduction. Yes, there are still women who are being subjugated. Yes, there are still women who unfortunately are not able to exercise agency or have access to the reproductive autonomy that other women do, and that needs to be changed, and that definitely needs to be a focus, and that needs to be something that we cannot forget. But zooming out on a mathematical or imperial fact basis, women on average across the entire globe have more reproductive autonomy than we ever had anytime before, and that is correlating with the lowest birth rates that we have ever seen in most areas and a global downward trend of the birth rate. Could that be attributed to something else? Absolutely. Like I said, correlation does not equal causation. However, I believe that the low birth rate is an indicator of sexual selection starting back up again in humans because of women being able to exercise their autonomy, and because that is a logical effect of women starting to be more choosy about their own reproductive decisions. Okay, now we need to talk about one of the biggest criticisms that I received, and that is when I suggested that, in my opinion, the first two things that women, given the agency to be very choosy over who they reproduce with if they choose to reproduce, was looking at violence and intelligence. And obviously, if you are from the original TikTok video, you know what happened in the comments. A massive debate about eugenics outbroke. And I want to be perfectly clear, I am in no way condoning that language being used. I am in no way suggesting that people start employing eugenic tactics. But I also want to be clear that I don't think that any of those arguments were in good faith or correct. So this is why. Again, we're going to get down to semantics. So if you look at the official, Oxford definition of eugenics, it is the study of how to arrange reproduction within a human population to increase the occurrence of heritable characteristics regarded as desirable. So technically, if you're going off of that definition, pretty much any kind of selection, all the way down to women preferring certain heights in their partners, preferring certain levels of intelligence in their partners, matchmakers, anything like that could technically fall under this definition. But that's obviously not what people were saying. So when we talk about what people actually mean when they refer to eugenics, they are talking about things like what happened in Nazi Germany. And I want to be very clear and point this out. We're getting a lot of criticism for women having agency over their partners as eugenics, when under the patriarchy, by that very definition, it was happening every single day. And in fact, the legitimate historical carrying out of eugenics happened under the patriarchy. So we are moving away from a system that allowed that and produced that, and I think that is why I think that argument is in bad faith. But specifically, we're not talking about a criteria. We're not talking about a list of desirable traits that we're trying to force to happen, and we're not talking about a list of undesirable traits that we're trying to weed out of the population. What we are simply talking about is women having agency over who they are going to choose, and in my opinion, the obvious thing that all women all across the world are subjected to and would not be subjected to if they had free will and choice and protection and community is violence from men. Plain and simple. We do not need protectors. We do not need men as protectors when the number one threat to a woman's life is men, particularly men who are currently in a romantic relationship with women, have recently been removed from a romantic situation with women, or who are attempting to pursue a romantic situation with a woman. Those people are the most dangerous thing to a woman's life in modern society. And so I think that women will absolutely, and we've already started seeing it, start banding together as a community, start sharing the names of those people, start ostracizing individuals who exhibit those traits, start declining and denying access to their presence and their body to people who exhibit ideologies, ideas, or behavior that we regard as unsafe or we regard as a red flag that they may eventually be a danger to ourselves or our children. And previously under the patriarchy, there was not a way to do that. It did not matter if somebody was violent to their spouse. It did not matter if somebody was violent to their children. They were handed a wife anyway. And oftentimes women willingly or on purpose married these people because they were experiencing extreme socioeconomic pressure to do so. Women could not hold credit cards. They could not have land. They could not do paid work, although they did massive amounts and still continue to do massive amounts of unpaid labor. They didn't have a choice. And now women have access to paid labor, to education, to other women and communities of that, and they are not going to intentionally or on purpose put themselves in a situation where their life can be ended or their children's lives can be heavily damaged or affected. Now I want to talk about intelligence and why I said that I believe women are going to start filtering for intelligence and address the concerns about ableism in that. So there's kind of two parts that I want to discuss. First is why I said intelligence in the first place. And I briefly addressed this already in a follow-up video, but essentially when I was researching this, there was a lot of different really interesting topics that came up, and I have to cut out a lot of that extra research to create a easy to follow and digestible and media friendly version. So when I wrote an article and when I made a 3-minute video, not every single thing that I have read made it into the final cut. And one of the things that was on my mind that I got to research and got to dive into a little bit was the possible intelligence linguistic link in humans. So going all the way back to Darwin himself, there was a theory that human language and linguistics actually developed because of, or at least in large part because of, female choosiness over mates, because essentially they believed that human women were more likely to select a mate who could do things like tell stories and create art and sing and have conversations and be funny things like that. So I thought that was a really interesting tidbit, I guess, that I came across when I was doing my research. And yes, I do have some great resources that you can read about as well that will be in the reading list below. Additionally, when we're talking about intelligence in like a broadly evolutionary sense, we are talking about adaptability, tool use, complex cooperation, things like that. So when that is where my brain was at when those words came out of my mouth. But I did receive enough criticism that I wanted to stop and look at it more on if suggesting, or if any of my words were interpreted in a way that suggested that I was saying that certain people who fall below a standard of intelligence, especially being that most of the ways that we measure intelligence have roots in white supremacy, racism, capitalistic bias, etc. If there was any way that my words could be interpreted as suggesting that anybody who does not meet that standard of definition is unworthy of procreating with or having their genes passed down. And I've looked at it and I see where people are coming from that. I definitely bristled because of the amount of people who rephrased my words in an unauthentic way. People who were saying that, well, you said this, and then proceeded to type out words that did not come out of my mouth. But all I can do at this point is say that this is where my mind was at, and acknowledge that yes, there are some serious societal definitions of intelligence that could be very harmful when we're talking about this. I more so believe when I'm talking about women having agency and predicting where that agency is going to go as far as who is going to be chosen to be reproduced with in the future. I do think that we are going to see women not put up with, we're going to say intentionally ignorant people who refuse to learn and have every ability to, people who continuously degrade women and kind of lock themselves into certain ideologies or put themselves into certain echo chambers that are overall harmful to society and humanity. I think one of the great words that came up a few times is like antisocial behavior. And that's really all I can say on that. Is after some examination, I can see where that may have been extrapolated. I do not particularly appreciate, if people are going to criticize me, I'd rather they criticize me on my words and not cheap imitations of what came out of my mouth. But I want to say here and now, I am not suggesting, nor do I endorse the idea that we should only be having children with the most intelligent people in society, because the methods in which we measure how intelligent somebody is are simply unreliable. I mean, the one thing I really want to say is we all have this tendency to look at everything through this lens of the patriarchy and through this lens of capitalism, and we don't really have any other lens to look through. That's all we've ever known. But I think at some point we forget that humans have some form of natural instinct. Humans have something that we don't necessarily understand. We have gut feelings, and we have a way to make decisions without being coerced and without being told what to think. And I really think when we're discussing women specifically and women's choices specifically, there was kind of this assumption that women would have to be guided, that women would have to be told who to choose or what to choose or how to choose it. And that really comes down to some very deeply set and deeply baked in misogyny that's in our culture, is this idea that we should not just trust women to be guardians of human evolution like every other species has shown that females would be capable of. And so I want to suggest that we consider what the future would look like if women were allowed to choose without those capitalistic lenses, without that patriarchal lens. And I understand that we're talking about something that would have to happen hundreds, if not thousands of years in the future. Now let's talk about who is having babies right now versus who isn't having babies, and does that spell out doom for humanity? This was brought up quite a lot in the comments, is the idea that certain groups of people, and I won't be flowery with my words, people were concerned about conservatives, about people in strict religious ideologies, people in poverty, people in low education statuses, all of that, still having quite a lot of children, and therefore humanity is doomed, because the only people not having children are those who are educated, are those who have wealth, who are intelligent, etc. And really what was going on is people were essentially saying, or reducing it to the idea that the ones that we want to be parents and the ones we want their genes passed down are not the ones having kids, and the ones who have the concerning behavior are the ones who are having kids. And I have a response to that, and so this is where we're really going to look at the diffusion of innovation. So the diffusion of innovation was originally developed by Everett Rogers. It should be right here. And it was initially used to map how society responds to technology. So I use this specific image for a reason, because you can see a chasm, which isn't included in a lot of models, but the chasm is essentially this space where a lot of technology dies, where you see innovators and early adopters, and it never actually hits the early majority. But the point of what I'm saying is, we, as far as where we are in the scope of women starting to exercise their own agency over reproduction, are right here, approximately. So as you can see, you're right. There are groups of people who are not going to get on board for quite some time. And when we're talking about social innovation and not technological innovation, a lot of times it's a much longer timeline, and it's over generations, because most people kind of have their ideas set in a generation, but the difference between one generation to another can be extremely drastic. So as new generations happen, more and more people theoretically are going to adapt this idea and accept this idea of women's agency, and we're going to see it become a lot more widespread until it is the majority of people. Even the groups of people are suggesting will not start exercising their agency. Anyway, thank you so much for joining me on that, and that is all I have for you on my deep dive today. I hope I was able to address all of the different questions and different ideas and different points that people had, and I just so appreciate you being here. I appreciate all 1 million plus of you that cared enough about my hypothesis to watch it and share it and debate it, and it's just been great, and I really hope that you stick around for some more of the content that I'm working on. See ya!